You might think you know Samsung as the company that made the phone in your pocket or the television in your living room. But in South Korea, the name means something entirely different. There it is possible to be born in a Samsung-built medical center, live in a Samsung-built apartment complex, attend a Samsung-owned university, and eventually have your funeral held in a Samsung parlor. They call it the Republic of Samsung, and it is not a nickname, it is a statement of economic reality. This single entity generates approximately 20% of the nation's entire gross domestic product. It is an economic singularity, a corporation that functions with the weight and influence of a sovereign state. But behind the glossy surface of high-tech innovation and global dominance lies a hidden infrastructure of dynastic control, political maneuvering, and a history written in blood and bribes. The story of the Lee family is the story of modern South Korea itself, a narrative built on a specific, ruthless deal between corporate ambition and national survival. To understand how one family gained the power to rival the government itself, we must look past the microchips and go back to the ashes of the post-war era where the bargain was first struck. The empire began with dried fish. In 1938, a young man named Lee Byung-chul opened a modest trading shop called Samsung Sanghoe in the city of Daegu. He dealt in noodles and local produce, exporting goods to China and Manchuria. It was unglamorous work, but Lee had a calculating instinct for survival. He navigated the brutal Japanese occupation and emerged from the chaos of the Korean War as a wealthy man in a destitute country. By the 1950s, South Korea was one of the poorest nations on Earth, a landscape of ruin desperate for reconstruction. But in 1961, the rules changed overnight. General Park Chung-hee seized power in a military coup. Park was a dictator with a singular obsession: industrialization at any cost. He looked at the wealthy businessmen of the era and saw them not as assets, but as targets. His military junta arrested the nation's top tycoons, Lee Byung-chul included, and charged them with illicit wealth accumulation. They were accused of profiteering while the nation starved. Lee was detained, but in a smoke-filled room, a deal was cut that would define the Korean economy for the next century. The government offered a pardon. In exchange, the business leaders would serve the state. This was the blueprint for the Chaebol. The government would provide massive, low-interest loans, tax breaks, and protection from foreign competition. In return, Samsung would build the industries the dictator demanded. They moved aggressively into sugar refining, wool textiles, and insurance. They grew explosively because the game was rigged in their favor. The government provided the capital, and Samsung provided the execution. It was a symbiotic relationship between the boardroom and the barracks. But this proximity to power carried a heavy price. In 1966, the company faced its first major humiliation: the saccharin smuggling incident. Customs officials discovered that a Samsung subsidiary was smuggling 55 tons of raw saccharin into the country, disguised as construction materials for a fertilizer plant to avoid taxes. At a time when the government was preaching austerity, this was viewed as a betrayal of the national trust. Public outrage was violent. To save his empire from being dismantled by an angry General Park, Lee Byung-chul had to make a sacrificial offering. He donated the massive fertilizer plant to the state and, in a humiliating public press conference, announced his retirement from management. He even allowed his second son to go to prison for the crime. It seemed like the end of the dynasty. But the scandal did not destroy the family. It ignited a brutal internal war for the throne. In the rigid hierarchy of traditional Korean society, succession is rarely a debate. It is a formula based on Confucian primogeniture. The eldest son inherits the mantle, the responsibility, and the power. For the Lee dynasty, that designated heir was Lee Byung-hee. However, following the founder's temporary retreat after the saccharine scandal, the eldest son's brief tenure at the helm was catastrophic. His management style was chaotic and abrasive, alienating the loyal lieutenants his father had cultivated for decades. Within months, the empire was in disarray, and the founder returned from retirement to ruthlessly strip his own firstborn of all power. This violation of tradition opened a fissure in the family that would never heal, triggering a vicious Shakespearean struggle for the crown. The second son, Lee Chang-hee, the one who had dutifully gone to prison for the family's smuggling crimes, returned to society expecting his loyalty to be rewarded with the chairmanship. Instead, he found himself marginalized. Enraged and humiliated, he committed the ultimate act of filial betrayal. In 1969, he filed a petition with the Blue House exposing his father's secret slush funds and illegal capital flight. It was a clumsy coup attempt, a prince's rebellion designed to use the dictator's hand to strike down the patriarch. But Lee Byung-chul was too valuable to the national economy. The government protected him, and the father exiled his second son from the family entirely, effectively erasing him from the corporate picture. The breach within the family would shape Samsung's future. With the first son deemed incompetent and the second son branded a traitor, the succession skipped a generation of logic and landed on the quiet, observant third son, Lee Geun-hye. While the brothers tore at each other's throats, the founder made the most consequential business decision in Korean history. In 1969, ignoring advisors who called it financial suicide, he founded Samsung Electronics. At the time, South Korea lacked the technology to manufacture even a simple circuit board. They began by assembling black and white television sets for Sanyo, humble work that critics dismissed. Yet this was the beginning of a vertical integration strategy that would eventually strangle global competitors. They did not just want to assemble parts, they intended to own the physics of the industry. But this rapid industrial expansion required absolute, unquestioned control over the workforce. Lee Byung-chul enforced a strict, non-negotiable, no-union policy that would define the company's culture for the next half-century. His philosophy was paternalistic but brutal. He would pay wages slightly above the industry average to buy loyalty, but he would crush any attempt at collective bargaining. He famously declared that he would have dirt in his eyes before he allowed a union to set foot in his factories. This created a sterile, disciplined environment where dissent was identified and removed before it could spread, ensuring that production lines never stopped for something as trivial as workers' rights. When Lee Byung-chul finally died in 1987, the transition was immediate and absolute. The third son, Lee Geun-hye, ascended to the chairmanship, inheriting a massive domestic conglomerate that dominated sugar, textiles, and cheap electronics. In most global family dynasties like the Tatars in India or the Wallenbergs in Sweden, succession is handled with boardroom decorum. In the Lee dynasty, it played out with the intensity of a civil war, leaving siblings in exile and a new king on the throne. But as he sat in the chairman's office, Lee Geun-hye knew that domestic dominance was no longer enough. He needed to conquer the world. For the first few years of his reign, Lee Geun-hye was a quiet monarch, largely underestimated by the old guard who viewed him as a fortunate son rather than a visionary. But the new chairman was seething. In 1993, during a tour of retailers in Los Angeles, he saw Samsung televisions gathering dust in the corners of electronics stores, ignored by customers who flocked to Sony and Panasonic. To the world, Samsung was still a second-tier manufacturer of cheap, unreliable appliances. Lee realized that without a radical transformation, the dynasty he inherited would become irrelevant. He summoned hundreds of his top executives to a hotel conference room in Frankfurt, Germany, and delivered a 3-day, non-stop lecture that would become the company's spiritual constitution. His ultimatum was stark and violent in its simplicity. Change everything except your wife and children. This was the Frankfurt Declaration, and Lee wasted no time enforcing it with theatrical brutality. When a batch of wireless phones was found to be defective, he didn't just order a recall, he ordered a public execution of the product. At the Geun-hye factory complex, 2,000 employees were forced to assemble in the courtyard. There, in front of the weeping workers who had built them, a pile of 150,000 phones worth $50 million was set on fire. As the plastic melted and black smoke choked the air, bulldozers crushed the charred remains. The message was terrifyingly clear. Quality was now a matter of life and death. This moment birthed the archetype of the Samsung man, an elite corporate soldier recruited from top universities, paid significantly better than his peers, and expected to display a Prussian level of discipline and loyalty to the chairman. This disciplined army was tested in 1997, when the Asian financial crisis decimated the South Korean economy. The country was on the brink of national bankruptcy, forced to accept a humiliating bailout from the International Monetary Fund. While rival conglomerates like Daewoo collapsed under the weight of their own debt, Samsung ruthlessly restructured. They slashed 30% of their workforce and spun off unprofitable units, a move that caused immense social pain but saved the empire. In fact, the crisis ultimately served the Lee family. As competitors vanished, Samsung consolidated its market share, emerging from the economic wreckage not just as a survivor, but as the singular, dominant engine of the South Korean economy. The balance of power had shifted. The state now needed Samsung more than Samsung needed the state. With this dominance came a sense of impunity that eventually dragged the shadow empire into the light. In 2005, a scandal known as the X-Files exploded into the public consciousness. A whistleblower released secret recordings from 1997, capturing Samsung's vice chairman discussing the delivery of cash-filled envelopes to senior prosecutors and politicians. The tapes revealed a systematic machinery of bribery designed to ensure that the judiciary and the legislature remained friendly to the conglomerate's interests. It was the first concrete proof that the Republic of Samsung was operating a shadow government, purchasing immunity as if it were just another raw material. Yet despite the public outcry, the family's grip remained unshakable because of a masterful piece of corporate engineering: circular shareholding. The Lee family actually owns a very small percentage of the total stock in the Samsung Group. However, through a complex, dizzying web where affiliate A owns affiliate B and affiliate B owns affiliate C, which in turn owns affiliate A, the family is able to wield absolute dictatorial control over the entire empire with only a minority stake. The structure is designed to make the dynasty coup-proof, ensuring that no matter how large the company grows or how many outside shareholders buy in, the throne remains secure. But as the company reached the zenith of its global power, the personal cost of this suffocating control began to surface in tragic ways. As the corporation ascended to the peak of its global influence, solidifying its status as the premier brand of the developing world, the internal pressure of the dynasty began to fracture the family itself. The most devastating blow came not from a courtroom or a boardroom, but from an apartment in New York's East Village. Lee Byung-chul was the chairman's youngest daughter, often referred to in the South Korean press as the Samsung Princess. She was 26 years old, vibrant, art-obsessed, and possessed a personal fortune of nearly $200 million. In a family defined by rigid discipline and silence, she was the anomaly. She ran a personal blog, engaged with the public, and lived a life that seemed, on the surface, to be a modern fairy tale. In November 2005, the fairy tale ended. Samsung officials released a somber statement claiming that the princess had died in a tragic car accident while studying abroad in New York. The narrative was tragic but palatable, fitting the carefully curated image of the family. Journalists outside the reach of the Republic quickly uncovered a darker reality. There was no car crash. There were no police reports of an accident. The truth was that Lee Byung-chul had been found dead in her apartment, having taken her own life with an electrical cord. The revelation shattered the carefully maintained facade of the Lee family. Reports surfaced that the princess had been suffering from severe depression, exacerbated by her father's unyielding opposition to her desire to marry a middle-class boyfriend. In the world of the Chaebol, marriage is not a matter of love, it is a matter of strategic alliance. The patriarch's refusal to allow the union was absolute. The cover-up of her suicide was a desperate attempt to protect the dynasty's prestige from the stigma of mental illness and familial discord, but its exposure only highlighted the suffocating, lethal weight of the expectations placed on the family members. They were the royalty of the Republic, but they were also its prisoners. While the family buried their daughter, the state began to close in on the father. In 2007, the dynasty's former chief legal counsel, Kim Yong-chul, turned whistleblower. He did not just leak rumors, he exposed the architectural blueprints of the family's corruption. He detailed a massive slush fund used to bribe prosecutors, judges, and government officials to ensure the family's legal immunity. The subsequent investigation was a national spectacle. Special prosecutors raided the chairman's home and office, seizing thousands of documents. In 2008, Lee Geun-hye was indicted for tax evasion and breach of trust. The verdict, however, revealed the true nature of power in South Korea. Despite being convicted of financial crimes that cost his company millions, Lee Geun-hye received a suspended sentence, a judicial slap on the wrist known cynically in Korea as the 3-5 rule, where tycoons receive 3 years in prison suspended for 5 years of probation. But the true display of his power came months later. In December 2009, the South Korean president issued a special single-point pardon for Lee Geun-hye. He was the only beneficiary. The justification was starkly utilitarian. The government needed the chairman's influence within the International Olympic Committee to help Pyeongchang win the bid for the Winter Olympics. The message was undeniable. Lee Geun-hye was not just a businessman, he was a diplomatic asset too valuable to be incarcerated. The law applied to citizens, but it did not apply to the architects of the national economy. The cycle of immunity and tragedy turned once again in May 2014. Lee Geun-hye, the titan who had transformed Samsung into a global superpower, suffered a massive heart attack. He was rushed to the Samsung Medical Center, where he would remain in a coma-like state for 6 years until his death in 2020. With the emperor incapacitated, the burden of the crown fell immediately to his only son, Lee Jae-yong, known in the West as Jae-y. Why Lee? The heir faced an existential crisis. To inherit his father's stock and maintain control of the empire, he would face an inheritance tax bill of roughly $10 billion, one of the highest in world history. Paying this honestly would require selling off so much stock that the family would lose control of the conglomerate. The solution was a controversial merger in 2015 between two affiliates, Chaebol Industries, which the family owned heavily, and Samsung C&T, the actual holding company of the group. The terms of the merger were aggressively skewed, effectively undervaluing C&T to boost the value of the family's holdings. It was a deal that made no financial sense for C&T's other shareholders, causing them massive losses. To push this deal through, the family needed the approval of the single largest shareholder in C&T, the National Pension Service, the public fund that manages the retirement savings of the Korean people. In a scandalous turn of events, the pension service voted for the merger, effectively diluting the retirement funds of millions of citizens to secure the succession of one billionaire. Why? Investigations later revealed a complex bribery scheme reaching the highest office in the land. Samsung had funneled millions of dollars, including $3 million for a championship dressage horse, to the daughter of Choi Soon-sil, a shaman-like confidant of then-President Park Chung-hee. This revelation was the spark that ignited the candlelight revolution. Millions of South Koreans took to the streets in freezing temperatures, demanding the removal of the president and the arrest of the Samsung heir. The anger was visceral. The public realized that their national pension fund had been treated as a piggy bank for the Lee dynasty. The protests succeeded, President Park was impeached and imprisoned, Lee Jae-yong was arrested, handcuffed and jailed for bribery and embezzlement. For a brief moment, it seemed the Republic of Samsung had finally fallen to the rule of law. But the pattern of history is difficult to break. Lee Jae-yong served only a fraction of his sentence before being released on parole, and in August 2022 he received a full presidential pardon. The reasoning was identical to his father's pardon a decade earlier: economic revitalization. With a global semiconductor war brewing and inflation rising, the government decided the nation could not afford to have the commander of its most important economic engine sitting in a jail cell. Today, the dynasty stands at a precarious crossroads. Lee Jae-yong is officially the executive chairman, but the aura of invincibility is gone. The republic still generates 1/5 of the nation's GDP, but the landscape has shifted. The company is fighting a brutal war on two fronts, maintaining its dominance in memory chips against a resurgent SK Hynix and fending off Chinese competitors who are rapidly closing the technological gap. Internally, the Samsung man culture of blind loyalty is fading as a younger generation of Koreans questions the cost of working for a corporate monarchy. The Lee family successfully bought their immunity and secured their succession, but in doing so, they exposed the machinery of their power to a public that is no longer willing to look the other way. The dynasty survives, but the question remains, in a modern democratic society, how long can a hereditary corporate monarchy coexist with the rule of law before something finally breaks? South Korea accepted a complex bargain, an economic miracle in exchange for a corporate monarchy that operates entirely above the law. The Lee family's ruthless ambition undoubtedly built a modern nation, yet their repeated scandals expose the terrifying fragility of that foundation. As the fourth generation eventually looms, the question remains whether this republic can truly survive the demands of a transparent democracy, or if the cycle of immunity will continue forever. If you value this kind of deep analysis into the hidden history of Asian economic power, please subscribe right now to join our exploration of the region's future.